All right. Well, last time we left Jack, he found the door. The door closed behind him, and he realized the key was stuck in the lock on the outside of the door. Let's finish the book up, shall we? Chapter 18. It's called Underground. Jack had known panic before. When he was 4, he'd wandered away from his mom at the big department store in Minneapolis, lost for a half an hour. That was panic. There was time last summer in the deep end of the municipal swimming pool. He'd come up for a big gulp of air and got water instead. That was panic too. But this was different. It was as if Jack had discovered a new land. Off in the distance there were sheer mountains of panic poking into a dark and twisted sky. Frantic waterfalls and desperate rivers of liquid panic swept toward him with a churning noise that blotted out all thought. Standing there on the landing, flashlight in one hand, wooden sword in the other, Jack saw before him an entire unexplored continent of pure, numbing terror. His heart pounded, his hands shook, his mind was racing. It was Friday afternoon before a 3-day weekend. The school was emptying fast. He was trapped, and he was cold. No one knew where he was, but Jack could change that. He could kick on the door, he could scream and pound and yell for help, and Jack did for 2 full minutes. Then he stopped. His ears were ringing, his hands were hurting, breathing hard, and he listened. Nothing. The sound had been muffled by the soft velvet curtains, and the little noise that it made across the stage had been swallowed whole by the yawning auditorium. Jack felt completely alone, but only for about 20 seconds. Small scritching sounds came from the darkness behind him. Turning around quickly, the beam of his flashlight caught a flick of a long pink tail as it disappeared through the low doorway. Rats! An involuntary shiver shook him. All of a sudden, the wooden sword that Jack gripped in his hand didn't seem silly at all. Did the beam of light flicker? It's hard to say how long the flashlight had been laying in his dad's desk. Batteries don't last forever, you know. But then Jack remembered. Maybe there was something else in the tunnels. Or someone else in the tunnels. Someone other than him and the rats. Someone who liked watermelon gum. And that someone must know how to get in and out. Maybe there would even be a way to get out without even being caught, without even having to deal with Mr. Ackerby. Jack's Viking cap fell off while he was pounding the door. He picked it up and put it right back on his head. Then he walked down the steps along the short corridor and ducked through the opening into the main tunnel. The tunnel was about 5 feet wide, its ceiling as high as the one in the access corridor. It ran off in both directions, further than his light could shine. A large pipe ran along the roof near the right-hand wall, suspended by steel rods embedded in the ceiling. It looked like cantaloupes could have rolled through an iron cylinder with ease. That's how big they were. So cantaloupes, they're about that big. Just kind of give you an idea. Every 20 feet or so, there was a joint, like a round steel collar studded with 6 large nuts and bolts. An electrical line ran along the center of the ceiling, with light bulb sockets at intervals. Some were broken, some were missing, but others looked just fine. Scanning the area, Jack saw no switch. There were some other bundles of wire running the length of the tunnel on the opposite side of the pipeline. Some looked like electrical wires, and some looked like telephone cables. The floor of the tunnel was level and smooth, and to Jack's relief, no rats in sight. An old paper cup and a dusty soda can lay on the floor near the opening, evidence of some workman's lunch or a coffee break. A thick layer of dust coated the floor. There was footprints, rats, and humans. But with no weather to disturb them, the human footprints could have been decades old. Decision time. Left or right? Jack sniffed and smelled nothing. There was no airflow, which made no sense. There's no open door. Then he crouched down and leaned over so his nose was about 6 inches away from the floor. The air was cooler close to the floor, and there seemed to be a flow coming from the right. So Jack's instinct was to walk towards where the airflow was coming from. But what if there were a lot of little flows? So Jack ran a test. Turning to his left, Jack walked 50 paces or 50 steps, stopped, leaned down, got his face near the floor again, where the airflow was weaker, but it was still coming from the same direction. Turning back to his right, he walked 50 paces back to the access opening. By going to the right, Jack was pretty sure he'd be walking in the westerly direction, basically parallel with Main Street, headed toward the public library, the police station, and downtown Huntington. At least that's the way it seemed. So Jack decided to go right. With the direction established, Jack didn't hesitate. He walked. And as he walked, his mind ran ahead into the darkness. He thought, let's just say I find somebody. How do I know this person's going to want to help me? What kind of person would be hanging out down here anyway? That thought stopped Jack in his tracks. He thought, what if it's some weirdo? Even a murderer or some Phantom of the Opera type creep, completely crazy, limping around with a knife or an axe. Standing still, listening to his heart pound in the silence, Jack decided he had no choice. The light from the flashlight definitely was dimmer, and he didn't want to be down here alone in the dark. He had to find a way out. Taking a fresh grip on his wooden sword, Jack went forward. He kept up a strong pace, leaning down every 3 or 4 minutes to test the air current to make sure he was still on the right course. After about 10 minutes and a brisk walk, he came to a junction, a crossroads. Stranger and stranger. As Jack stood in the center of the junction, his nose picked up a familiar scent, and he knew he wasn't imagining it. It wasn't the smell of watermelon gum. Now there was a faint but unmistakable smell of peanut butter? But the junction posed a problem. He could either walk straight or go down one of the other 3 tunnels, one on his right, 2 on his left. And he imagined where he was. Had he walked in as far as the library, about 4 blocks? Or was he farther along, say down the town hall or the small shopping area? It was kind of impossible to know. And did he really want to try pounding on a door that might be the basement of the town hall or the police station? Jack decided to go with his nose again, but when he sniffed at the opening of each tunnel, the peanut scent seemed to be everywhere. So, starting with the tunnel on his left and each tunnel in order, he did the 50 paces, lean over, and sniff test. After about 15 minutes of walking back and forth, Jack had reached the verdict. The only tunnel that had the scent at all was the one that he should have taken by going straight when he first came to the junction. Jack sat down to rest for a few minutes. He was winded and sweating pretty hard. But sitting was no good. For one thing, he started to get cold quickly, and another, it was way too quiet. Too much like a tomb. Jack didn't like the thoughts that crowded into the silence. And Jack didn't like sitting on the same floor rats had scurried around on. So he got up and continued moving. After another 10 minutes, Jack didn't need to stoop and smell the floor or smell the peanut butter. It was a pretty strong smell, but compared to how faint it had been, it had seemed like Jack was eating his own peanut butter and jelly sandwich. He kept walking, careful not to let his wooden sword tap on the floor of the tunnel. In another 100 steps, Jack stopped and listened. Was that a distant car horn? Was he under a street? He heard nothing but the occasional scurry of little feet, and he decided to keep still for at least another few minutes, and he turned his flashlight to save some batteries. The darkness of underground places is different. Underground darkness is complete. There's no street lights, no stars, no moon, no light reflected from the clouds. And Jack knew this. He'd seen pictures of animals living in caves. Some of them gradually evolved to have no eyes at all. With zero light, the pupil in the human eye would open up so wide that the color iris almost disappears. So basically, the blue part of my eyeball, it almost wasn't there. The black part was so big. Have you ever seen a cat get really excited and the cat's eyeball gets like really, really black? That's kind of what he's talking about. The eye strains to see, and without the essential ingredient, light, it sees absolutely nothing. Jack shut his eye, leaning against the wall opposite the big pipe. He wanted his eyes to forget the brightness of a flashlight. He wanted to experience the utter darkness, that cave darkness. When he opened his eyes, Jack had to blink to be sure they were really open. He held up his hand, touched his nose, and even waved it around just inches from his face. Nothing. He opened his eyes until he imagined they must be as big as oranges, and still nothing. Pushing away from the wall, standing in front of the center tunnel, Jack put his arms out and turned in a slow circle, eyes wide open. An odd thing happened. As he turned, it was as if there was a small, dark rectangle hanging in midair. Dark, but not so dark that everything else seemed to sweep right past as he turned. Jack rotated until the dark rectangle was directly in front of his eyes, and when he stood still, so did the rectangle. It could only mean one thing. It was light. The small rectangle was the shape of the tunnel, farther on in any direction that he'd been walking. Somewhere up ahead there was light, and peanut butter. And what else? Well, Jack turned on his flashlight and walked ahead, quickly and quietly. Chapter 19. Two more left after this one. It's called Walk into the Light. As Jack walked silently forward, every 100 steps or so, he turned off his flashlight. The light ahead grew brighter. Abruptly, he came to a T in the tunnel, and at that moment, he learned why it was called the steam tunnel. Heat radiated from the large iron pipe, and there was a faint hissing sound where the pipe he'd been walking beside met the pipe in the new tunnel. There was a valve with a large round handle. A steady drip of hot water had made the puddle on the floor at the junction. There was no guessing work now. The light was coming from the left. There was enough of a glow bouncing around the walls of the tunnel that Jack turned off his flashlight and let his eyes adjust to the dimness. The light grew stronger with every 20 paces, or 20 steps, and coming around a 45-degree bend to the left, Jack stopped in his tracks. It was a place where the two tunnels had crossed. The junction was like a tic-tac-toe frame, 4 corridors meeting in a center square. In the corridor to Jack's right, the old refrigerator stood against the wall below the steam pipe. Some coat hooks had been fastened to the wall beside the refrigerator, and a navy blue wool coat, a gray scarf, and a green backpack were hung up. On the left of the wall of the corridor, straight ahead, Jack saw a folding army cot with an olive green blanket folded nearly at the end of one, and a pillow at the top of the blanket. On the tunnel wall opposite the cot, there was a low wooden bookcase. A large black and white cat sat on the bookcase and looked at Jack with wide green eyes. A statue with a twitching tail. In the center square, a card table, one folded metal chair sat on a piece of dark green carpet. On the table lay a pencil and a newspaper turned into a half-finished crossword puzzle. There was a paper plate and a plastic knife, and an open jar of crunchy peanut butter. In the corridor to Jack's left, a tall floor lamp with a fringed shade stood right beside the worn-out easy chair. The lamp was on, and the chair sat a young man wearing black jeans and a tie-dye t-shirt. A book lay open in his lap. Pushing a strand of long blonde hair out of his eyes, he looked up as seeing Jack appear was the most natural thing in the world. He looked curiously at Jack's sword. Nice sword. I've been listening to you coming for about a half an hour now. Sound travels a long way down here. Pointing at the peanut butter, Jack said, I followed my nose. I got stuck upstairs at the school and locked myself in, so... Taking a closer look, Jack guessed the boy who was 17 or 18. Do you live here? The boy shook his head. Nah, I'm just hanging out for a while. Jack looked around. Well, where did all this stuff come from? Did you bring it here? Nope, I guess it's been here for a long time. There's a guest list on the wall by the fridge, and it goes way back. It's pretty strange. Jack was still trying to take it all in. But, I mean, like the fridge and the electricity and everything? It's like an apartment. The kid grinned and said with a friendly sarcasm, That's what it is. It is, in fact, like a little apartment. I think you have now understood. You've now said about all I can say about it. Jack didn't pick up on the sarcasm. And what about the rats? The kid jerked his head toward the cat. That's Caesar's job. He comes with the place. So, like, you're allowed to be here? Jack asked. The boy shrugged. Allowed? I don't know. And I don't care. All I know until my dad calms down or gets some serious help, I'm spending my nights here. I mean, it's a little spooky and I don't have my stereo, but it's a lot safer than my house is right now. And John and I could use Blaze. So, yeah, I guess I'm allowed. Jack knew right away who he knew. But he asked to make sure. John said you could use the place? John who? John the janitor. He works at the high school. He knows my dad, and last year he said if I ever needed help, I should tell him. So about a week ago, I needed help, and I told him, here I am. You talked to John last year? The kid nodded. Some of my friends said he knew he was a good guy, so I checked him out, started shooting the breeze, and means talking with him. Shooting the breeze, and one afternoon, when I was in detention, he was working on something in the room, light switch or something. He was just easy to talk to. Like, first I just asked what he was doing, and he didn't brush me off. He really told me stuff. Showed me how the circuits and the whole deal, how it all worked. I'm interested in stuff like that, and he could tell. So he just kept showing. Then he asked me my name, and I said, I'm Eddie Walson. And that's when he tells me if I ever needed help, look him up. Turns out he knows my dad from the VFW. It's the Veterans of Foreign Wars. It's like the VA Dawn out in White City. That's kind of what that is. Jack shook his head, not understanding. The VFW? He said, yeah, it's a little white house near the diner in town. Has the sign, Veterans, Foreign Wars, VFW. It's like a club for guys that were in the service and fought in wars and stuff. Guys can help each other, talk about problems and stuff. The war messes a lot of guys up. Messed up my dad. He was in the National Guard and his unit got called up for Desert Storm in the Gulf War. That was back in the early 2000s is when that war took place. Jack nodded. Anyway, that's how come John knew my dad, and that's how come I'm here. Eddie was done being sociable. Standing up, he said, you want to get out of here, right? Jack nodded. Yeah, where are we anyway? Eddie said, we're about a block away from the fire station. How'd you get into the tunnels, and did you find an open door? Jack said, well, sort of, at my school. That where you found the sword? Jack nodded. Eddie nodded back and said, cool. Jack pointed at the wall near the corner of the refrigerator. He took 2 steps closer and bent down to read it. Did you sign the guest list? You bet, said Eddie. I'm part of the Huntington history now. Jack scanned the list. He turned on his flashlight and he could read some of the names. They'd been written on a smooth patch with white concrete with pencils and markers, and even a crayon or two. Dozens of names going all the way back to the 1970s. Then Jack did a double take. For the first name on the wall was Lou Carswell, 1973. Jack wanted to look at every name, but Eddie had run out of patience. The best place to get out is where I do. John knows this guy at the fire station, and he gave me the key to the door that comes out of the basement hallway there. That's where the steam comes from. There's like a big boiler in that fire station. Still heats the library and town hall. Keeps me toasty. So let's go. Jack almost had to trot to keep up with Eddie's long strides. There were no lights once they left the living area, but Eddie didn't slow down, and he didn't use a flashlight. Jack thought, maybe Eddie is evolving. Maybe one day Eddie will have no eyes at all. Not possible. In 5 minutes, they came to an opening in the wall, and Eddie said, that's it. He ducked into the opening and flipped a switch by the door. A dim bulb lit the short corridor. Eddie listened by the door. There were voices on the other side, and they got louder and louder and began to get fainter and fainter. Eddie pulled out a key and put it into the lock, but held up his hand. He whispered, wait a minute. Anybody sees you out there, just tell them you came in the back door to use the bathroom. It's right down the hall by the left. After a minute of silence, Eddie asked, what grade are you in? Jack said, I'm in 5th. So you're at the old high school this year, right? Jack nodded. Well, when you see John, tell him Eddie says hi, okay? Jack said, I'll tell him. And listen, John's a good guy to know. Like, if you ever get in trouble, I mean, like, real trouble, you ought to get to know him. Jack said, "Yeah, I'm gonna do that." It was quiet in the hallway, so Eddie opened the door a crack. Really, Stella? Adding suspense to a story that doesn't even need suspense. Hey, stop. That's annoying. It was quiet in the hallway, so Eddie opened the door a crack. Jack said, "Eddie, I think you should keep this sword, okay? I don't think I better try and carry it through downtown." Eddie took the sword and hefted it appreciatively, and he nodded. "Cool." Jack said, "Hey, do you have any gum, Eddie?" Eddie reached into his pocket. "Yeah. Well, what flavor?" Jack asked. Eddie pulled out an open pack. "Watermelon. You want a piece?" Jack smiled and said, "No thanks, I'm good." Eddie opened the door and said, "See you, little buddy." Jack stepped out. "So long, Eddie. Thanks." Eddie closed the door. Chapter 20. 2 + 2. Outside the steam tunnel door, Jack blinked in the bright bluish light. The corridor in the basement of the firehouse was empty, so he headed for the exit sign and the stairs to his right. 30 seconds later, Jack was standing in the steadily falling snow at the corner of the Maple and Williams, and then it hit him. Jack realized he must be late. He said he would be back at the shop at 5. Looking at the window of the convenience store, Jack saw the time. It was 5:45. Instinctively, he started running north on William Street towards Main Street. A quick fall on the snowy sidewalk, and Jack realized running was not a good idea. Unhurt, he dusted himself off and then walked as quickly as he could. Jack knew his dad would be worried. He might have even left. The school might be locked. Should he go to the store and try to call the school or try and call home? He hoped his dad wouldn't be too angry or, even worse, disappointed him again. Jack tried to pick up the pace as he continued slipping along toward the high school. When he got to Main Street and turned east, he had to walk against the wind. It was really cold, not by Minnesota standards, but still cold enough. By bending his head down, the brim of his Vikings cap kept the snow out of his face, and he could only look up to check the cross traffic when he reached the curb. When Jack passed the library, he picked up his pace. The sidewalk in the heart of town had already been sanded, so there was less danger of falling. He only had about 4 or 5 blocks to go. Lifting his head to look out from underneath the brim of his cap, Jack saw something through the snow. The next street, Randall Street. A car with its lights on was parked behind the stop sign, but it wasn't a car, it was a pickup. A green pickup. John Rankin flashed his headlights, and Jack waved at him. Jack wanted to slow down. 30 more steps and he would be there. Think fast, think. What could he say? No coat, no backpack, walking alone downtown in the snow? Jack thought, I can say I left my stuff at the library and got involved in a book, saw the time and ran outside. Jack felt the lice strangling him, and deep down he knew it wouldn't work. He knew he didn't want to try and make it work. Jack could see the truck's wipers ticking back and forth. Jack stood at the crosswalk, waited for the salt truck to rumble past, and then he crossed the street. John Rankin rolled his window down halfway. Jack smiled as best as he could. Hi, Dad. His dad cut him off, a sharp edge to his voice. Come get out of the snow, Jack. Jack said, but my coat and my backpack are... Just get in the truck, Jack. I've got him. Jack didn't understand. My coat? And my backpack? Just get in. It was that angry and relieved voice, the kind parents use only when they finally located a missing child. Jack walked around the back of the truck and got in the passenger side. As he shut the door, his dad reached over and flicked the fan switch on high. In the light from one of the old downtown lampposts, Jack saw his coat and backpack in the seat. He said, You found him? Dad said, Yep, no thanks to you. You had me and everyone else worried sick. John Rankin paused, getting control of himself. I've been waiting here for about 20 minutes. About 5:15 I called home just to be sure you didn't snag a ride with a friend. Lois said you weren't there, so I started putting 2 and 2 together. Very meekly, Jack said, 2 and 2? His dad nodded. I checked the supply closet. and saw that you put your stuff away. Then I smelled something funny. Over behind the door, that's quite a load of gum in that pail. Jack said, but how? His dad held up his hand and said, if you'll just hold your horses, I'll tell you. I found you because I looked up from your bucket full of gum in the closet, and there I see the lock on the key safe, and it's not latched. That's when it clicked. John Rankin paused for a few seconds and said, How'd you like the view from the bell tower?" Jack gulped. His dad went on, That was you up there, right? On Tuesday. I thought I heard something. The school gets real quiet once those kid leaves." Another pause. "So, did you like the view?" Jack nodded. He could tell his dad wasn't really mad now, so he said, I just wanted to see it. I'd never seen the whole town before." John Rankin allowed himself to smile a little. "What gets me is that from all those keys, you picked my two favorites. I've been up that tower, I don't even know how many times. I go up there to sit and think sometimes." Jack remembered the chair on the third landing. And the other key? How did you find out I had that one?" His dad said, "Now that was a little bit more lucky of a guess. I mean, I could have figured it out, but I would have had a hard time get that master key log and starting to count until I found another stack that was one key short, but that would have taken me all night. It was because the tunnel key was right there near the bottom next to the tower key. I guessed that if I were you, I'd go take that one. And of course, I knew you were working on the auditorium, so 2 + 2 = 4. I'm sorry I made you worry, Dad." John Rankin cleared his throat. "Well, I could see just what happened, you leaving the key in the door and all. I went down to the tunnel with the light and I saw your footprints. I almost started yelling, and you probably could have heard me too, but I knew you wouldn't have come to any harm. If I needed to find you, I knew I could. And sometimes you just have to step back and let things play out." His dad fell silent and flipped the heater switch back to low. As the fan got quieter, the rhythmic sound of the windshield wipers seemed louder. Jack felt Jack felt funny, like he was different. He wanted to tell his dad everything, and he wanted to know more. Jack said, "Dad, I met Eddie. You know Eddie Walson? I saw the place in the tunnel, and Eddie let me come out the door at the fire station." John Rankin leaned forward and released the parking brake. He pushed on the clutch, dropped the shift lever into first gear, and eased it out onto Main Street. And all he said was, "We better head home now." Last chapter. Chapter 21. Something Permanent. It was slow going on Main Street. The road crews were out, but the temperature was dropping quickly and the snow was coming faster than the salt could melt it. The pickup crawled along past the library, and Jack stared out at the snow. It came rushing at the windshield. Jack loved looking up at the streetlights during a snowstorm. Those millions of swirling flakes had reminded him of a wild, happy dance. But not now. They looked frantic, confused. The flakes crashed and tumbled in the air, fierce and chaotic. Had he said something wrong? His dad was 3 feet away, but it seemed like that he was in a distant room. Jack felt the door, like the door had slammed in his face. "Dad, I didn't mean to. I mean, about the tunnel. I won't tell anybody." John Rankin looked across the room and smiled. Jack had never seen a smile like that before. His dad said, "Jackie, I know that. I know you wouldn't tell anyone. It's just that place is... well, it's a whole other story. And I think the story you're old enough to know about now. And when I try to think about how I'm going to tell you, it brings back a lot of memories." His dad looked like he was close to tears. Jack said, "Well, I saw Lou's name on the wall. It said Lou Carswell, 1973. Did Lou really stay there?" John Rankin laughed and looked out the window for a moment. "You sure do get a right to... wait, let me try that again. You sure do get right to the heart of things, don't you, Jackie? Yes, Lou did spend some time living down there, and that's a pretty good place to start the story. But really, I have to go back even a few years before that." Go get that bird. Dog. Jack knew what that meant. A few years before 1973 was when my dad had been in the Army. John Rankin said, "The time I spent in the Army was hard for me, of course. I mean, going into the service is never an easy thing, and thank God there are men and women who still take on that job. I had 2 hours of duty with the infantry, down on the ground. I went through some awful times, and I lived through things that I pray you never or nobody else ever has to live through." In the moving light in the shadows, Jack could see his dad's clenched jaw. Then he took a deep breath and let it out slowly. "When I got back to Huntington after Vietnam, I was in a bad way. I was scared a lot of the time. I got sick really easy. I lived at home for a while, but my dad didn't know how to help, and my mom wasn't well enough herself. I was the last thing she needed right then. I wasn't doing well at all. And for about a half a year, I went and stayed at the Veterans Hospital this side of Minneapolis. I was just barely holding on. Then, once, when I came down for the day to see Mom and Dad, I got it in my head to say hello to my senior English teacher at the high school. I went into her room after school, and she wasn't there. Janitor said she moved to St. Paul, another town in Minnesota. Well, he and I got to talking, and it turns out he'd been in the same field division as me, but during the Korean War, quite a few years before the Vietnam War. And right out of the blue, he asked me if I could work nights cleaning up at the high school. Said he really needed the help. I didn't learn until about 3 years later that he gave up his overtime hours to let me back to feeling useful. Those nights at the school were good for me. I was in a familiar place, a place full of good memories. It was just what I needed. Tom Baldridge, that's his name, he retired about 12 years ago. I'm not just talking when I tell you that the day Tom put a broom in my hands, he saved my life." Jack said, "Is that Lou in the picture on your dresser? And that big knife in your top drawer, was that your Army knife?" John Rankin laughed out loud. "You ought to go into detective work, get paid for all your snooping. That sure is my knife, and you kept clear of it, Mr. Nosy Man." And yes, that's Lou in the picture. I met Lou my second tour, and we teamed up, looked out for each other. You and a dozen or so patrols with the same person, you get to be really close, like family. I carried a letter to his parents and his girlfriend, and he carried a letter to my folks just in case. We used to joke that we kept each other alive because neither one of us wanted to have to deliver those letters. But when I got out at the end of my hitch, Lou still had another 12 months to go. Lou was from Chicago, and after he'd been home a while, he came to visit me. He needed work, and needed a place to stay where he wouldn't be a bother to anyone. So that's when I rigged up that place in the tunnel. A friend of mine at the fire station helped me and Lou get a place fitted out. And I helped Lou get a job working nights cleaning up at town hall. Once he had a steady work, he moved into a rented room. But we left all the stuff in the tunnel. A few years later, there was an opening at the high school, so that's the history of Lou Carswell. There were only about 3 blocks of Greenwood Street, and Jack still had so many questions. "Well, what about all the other names?" he asked. It's a long list, and are all the others your friends too?" His dad nodded. "My friends, Lou's friends, and sometimes a kid like Eddie, caught in a hard spot and needed a safe place for a few days. A lot of people know that place is there, and when there's need, someone gets in touch." His dad nodded. "A lot of people know?" asked Jack. "What if someone told the principal or the school committee or the police? Don't you think it's probably against the law?" John Rankin smiled. It felt odd to have his son worried about him for a change. "Well, I've looked into that. As far as I can tell, the only thing that might be guilty of is using some town electricity. I put an electric meter on the right at the get-go, and every month since October 1973, I've been paying the going rate in a cash donation to the annual Veterans Day Parade Fund. And I keep careful records. Anyone who wants to take me to court, I'm all set. I think I can pull together a pretty good group of witnesses." Then, with a wink, he said, "Now, you, on the other hand, you might have to go to jail for having a pocket full of keys. But don't think we would get Mr. Ackerby to testify that you're genuinely a temporary janitor. And a darn good one, too." And Jack said with a grin, "Just like you?" Jack and his dad were still laughing as the truck turned into the snowy driveway at 920 Greenwood Street. Above the basketball backboard on the garage, the floodlights were lit. As the pickup came to a stop, Jack looked through the windshield, up into the light, and he saw millions of snowflakes swirling in the wind. A happy dance. Helen Rankin pulled aside the curtain above the sink to look out the back window. She saw the two boys get out of the truck. Or maybe was it two men? As they came toward the house, John Rankin carried Jack's backpack in one hand, and on the other hand was on his son's shoulder to steady himself. They were trying to catch snowflakes in their tongues, laughing and almost falling down. Helen was stuck with an image. Her first baby, her little Jack, didn't seem so little. Somehow he was older, stronger, and her husband, her best friend, her own John, seemed younger, less burdened. Helen knew what she was looking at. This wasn't an illusion. It was a fleeting sensation. It was something exclusive happening across the border in Boyd territory. Helen was completely familiar with what she was seeing. It was something good, something permanent. It was love. With a full heart, Helen let the curtain fall back in place. Walking to the front of the house, she called up the stairs, "Lois, they're home. Come for dinner now." Then she went back to the kitchen to let the door open for Jack and his dad. Cool story. I like that one. So now we've read two different stories. Stella, just people walking, they can do that. Knock it off. Hey. So now we've read two stories from Andrew Clements, and they both turned out to be some pretty cool ones. Now, you see a little bit of similarities between these two books. With Frindle, it was about a boy who created a new word, and the teacher ended up saying, "Nice job." And in this one, boy starts off kind of upset that his dad's a janitor at the school. Had a notification on my phone. It starts out being mad at his dad, and then come to find out he's not a bad guy after all. There's a lot that he doesn't know about his dad. So think about that. You never know what kind of books you're going to get into, so I would encourage you guys over the summertime, read some books. I'm curious to know, as we hopefully get back into school next year for 4th grade, I want to know what kind of books you read and kind of what messages you got from these books and how they made you feel after reading them. Good book. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Please feel free to go back and listen to it as much as you want, because it's a good one. It almost got me choked up a couple times, but I didn't. Cool. We'll see you guys later.